All right. Hello, community, and thank you for joining us on our Together We Thrive podcast series. On today's episode, we will be exploring how Pulse survivors can honor and commemorate their loved ones on the upcoming anniversary on June 12th, 2020, which is just a few days away. This year marks the fourth year since the tragedy happened. And with the current national issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, mixed in with other personal matters, many survivors and community members may be wondering how they can find ways to navigate all of these issues and still maintain their well-being. We understand that there is a need to bring up some of hard topics to discuss, and some of our listeners may be experiencing a lot of pain and suffering. So we wanted to create a safe space to talk about these issues today. Please keep in mind that this may not be suitable for young children, as we may talk about complex emotions or complex topics, and parental guidance is advised. Today we have invited a guest speaker who is here to provide us some guidance and advice for our community. I'd like to welcome Rachel Presswood. Pronouns they, them, theirs. Just to give you a little bit of background on Rachel. Rachel Presswood is a behavioral health therapist and registered clinical social work intern with a background in services across various mental health programs, care programs in Central Florida community. Rachel has provided therapeutic services for crisis intervention, detoxification, inpatient, residential, and outpatient treatment, supporting clients with diverse intersectionality to meet many different mental health and wellness needs. They have a history of working with survivors of complex trauma, including childhood abuse, interpersonal violence, impacts of incarceration and lack of housing, discrimination, and human trafficking. They have also worked in the aftermath of events impacting communities, including working with Pulse survivors and affected individuals and families. So, hello, Rachel.
Hi there, Jesse. Thank you.
I know you are currently with the 26 Health nonprofit organization. Would you like to tell our audience a little bit about your work there?
That'd be great. Thank you. So thank you for welcoming me and introducing me first. I know that right now, amid so many different things happening in communities and globally, that there are so many voices that might be, hoping to be heard. And my goal today is to share from my perspective as a clinician, the best that I can, and to hope that that supports someone along their journey. But it's definitely not the absolute answer to everything. It's just a perspective. Also, I guess with 26 Health, the work that I get to do is pretty awesome. I've been there for about a year, a little longer, and I work with the LGBTQIA+ community and allies, and I get to provide daily therapy services for people, but also with the size of the agency and the evolution that it's had over time, we get to create some pretty cool projects that maybe see a need and try to fill it. So I really enjoy that about being there and looking at what does the community need and how can we help. So I'm always welcoming feedback about that and looking to collaborate with people. So that's been pretty cool. 26 Health has a multidisciplinary staff supporting inclusion and competent access to mental and physical health care. And they also have patient care coordination, adoptions that are starting to rev up new services there that we're excited that we just get to offer. We got a license for that. We're starting to get our first families and youth, and then also spa services. And I think each of those things has a unique place in the LGBTQ community. And so I'm glad to be a part of that.
Well, thank you. That seems like a pretty comprehensive facility that you guys have. And, I know the community needs people like you, definitely being there at the front lines, because there's so much services out there in the community that everyone can utilize. And definitely, I wanted to use that to segue a little bit into what today's topic or discussion is on with the 4-year anniversary or remembrance events that's coming up for some of our survivors. And I wanted to just kind of start to delve into that. If I was to be in let's say if I was to be in the shoes, or if someone was a Pulse survivor and June 12th is just coming up, there's a couple of days and there's this anticipation that's growing. What may that look like for some of the survivors, and what may they be experiencing, and what can we say to that?
Sure. Um, well, June 12th coming up serves as a reminder, and most anniversaries do. And when we're thinking about something that was distressing in our past, a reminder can also serve as a bit of a trigger. And when our brain senses that there's reminders in the form of like dates or maybe even sound, smells, places, or for some people, the time of night, any of those reminders can kind of engage a stress response in the body. From there, you might notice that in varying degrees, you have anxiety, mood changes, maybe even physical tension, concentration, memory, focus challenges. You might have intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares about this event that you thought maybe were past and that you didn't have to worry about anymore. Sometimes they can come back up, maybe more temporarily for a time. And then also you might have changes in appetite, trouble sleeping. So if you're getting to know yourself and looking out for these things, that can be important. You might even notice the desire to numb more. Maybe your brain subconsciously wants to avoid that this is coming again. So filling up your time, staying busy, maybe unnecessarily, which can make more stress. So that's a challenge too. Also, staying busy sometimes can help. So I have more information I can share about that, but I sense you wanted to ask a question again.
Yeah, no, it was, you mentioned that sometimes people, it's interesting that you said that sometimes some people may want to take on more tasks or kind of fill up their days with busyness. Is that a way of distracting? Is that all, you said that's kind of a telltale sign, right?
For some people it can be. I think that when we fill up our time, we are distracted and focused in some other way that's engaging the mind. So it doesn't really have the chance to be stuck focused in a loop on maybe some distressing thoughts that are coming up. So it's a natural thing to want to stay busy when we're feeling stressed. However, for some people, it can make them more stressed. Maybe they're taking on too much that isn't really productive. It may be counterproductive to helping them to feel relief during the time when they need it. And for other people, maybe there's a healthy balance of distraction. Maybe there are certain tasks that might help them to stay engaged, or doing more busy work, cleaning the house, things like that. That could be helpful. So it's really unique to each individual, what their experience is right now, and also how they're responding, and what might help them.
And is there a way for them to determine what's a healthy limit and what may be some sort of like, okay, this is, is it, hey, this isn't common to you, or this is who this is usually what you would do, but you kind of seem to take, instead of taking 5, you're taking on 15 or 10. And so how, I know each individual is unique, but how is there kind of like a general way of determining, hey, this is really starting to get in the way?
I think with any of these things, there can be a balance of them that might be natural. Like even remembering things about the event doesn't necessarily have to be overly distressing and frequent. But if you're finding yourself getting too busy, too stressed, I would just encourage you, if you're trying to discern, is it the right level for me right now? Do I need this level of distraction, or is it causing me more problems? Maybe checking in with yourself, pausing, noticing, like, are there things on my schedule that I'm feeling kind of like I don't really want to be doing, but I've taken on for some reason? It's really about pausing for a moment to look within and notice, what's my motivation for all of this? Are these things that need to be done now? Am I happy to do them now? Is my sleep getting disturbed because I'm too busy during the day? Are there other ripples of me taking on too much that are causing my life problems? So kind of that inventory personally to check in and see. And if you find the balance is there and you're eating and sleeping and you feel good about it, that's up to you. Yeah.
Okay. It's the reason why I had asked that was because it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Sometimes you think that if someone is dealing with a lot of stress, it's typical for many people to think that if you're having this really sad event and you're kind of depressed, there's this lack of energy, there's no motivation, you're kind of maybe just laying in bed. And so that one might be easier to pick up. But I think sometimes the signs that we miss is this kind of like, you're really trying to put all these things in front of the real source of what's causing you pain, right? And, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's something that some of some of our listeners might not have thought about. And if you are listening, yeah, just keep that in mind. And what other things, if as a survivor, okay, so we're starting to become aware of these signs, these kind of triggers, these little warning signs that our body might be giving us, or we're doing these behaviors, right? Are we doomed to that? Are we, do we just say, screw it, it is what it is? Or are there things that the survivors can do to help them alleviate that pain or help them alleviate that suffering and anxiety?
Sure. So I think it is important to acknowledge that first, the goal is just to notice these things. So in inventorying all the potentials, we want to notice them first, really checking in with ourselves and saying, I feel different lately. Why is that? Kind of investigating and seeing if you personally have come up with some of these ways, which might be staying in bed more. It might be filling up your schedule. It might be different for each person. So as you start to have that awareness, you might be able to develop some understanding of why with resources like this that help you to see, okay, maybe there's a change for me right now because the 12th is coming, because I've had this experience, and that it's a common thing for people to have a change in their distress level or their mood level during this time. So when there's that awareness that it's a common human experience, oftentimes people can give themselves a little more kindness or compassion. So instead of feeling badly about the way that we're feeling badly, which can make it worse, I encourage people to start with recognizing it for what it is, having some self-compassion and kindness so that you can then make the choices to set yourself up for success as much as possible. So if you know that you're feeling low, maybe the choice is to, instead of isolate, be intentional to set up times to connect with people that you care about. If you find that you're doing too much and you're feeling that tension all day, every day, and you're feeling anxious, maybe it's to set up things in your life that help you to relax and unwind very intentionally, making time for that with purpose. So everybody's different. Does exercising help? Connecting with your loved ones? Asking for help more around the house or in your job? Talking about how you're feeling, getting outside, meditating, your favorite hobbies. Maybe there's uplifting music that you recognize you've been kind of turning away from for a while because you've been focused in your thoughts. There's art, journaling, all sorts of things. So are you making time for things that help you to get through with intention during this time? I think that's the big piece, because if we notice it, then we can have some kindness about it to ourselves, and then we can do something differently to support ourselves to get through this season of time.
And so I know you mentioned a couple of great terms. I think you said, just kind of taking inventory of what are some of the things that you're, just to kind of summarize, taking inventory of some of the things that you're noticing about yourself, the emotions, the behaviors, the anxiety, all of the above. Or even if, and you could also take inventory of maybe even if you're happy, if you need to do this kind of, right, do this check-in. Oh, no, well, I am sleeping. I am okay. I do feel sad, but I am sleeping. I am eating. Okay, so I can continue.
Yes.
And then, just kind of recognizing to continue to practice that self-compassion, doing things. I think you mentioned some of, if you can just repeat one of the, what did you say? Some of the self-compassion would be, can you repeat one of them again?
So I guess when I think about self-compassion, I think about ways to show kindness and nurturing to yourself. Are you pausing with intention to say, you can take a nap, it's okay, or like, it's okay to feel the way you feel, and maybe even more than that, you want to make some art or journal about that, and that's worth your time. And then I listed off various different ways that people might choose to cope during this time to hold space for themselves.
And so practicing self-compassion is definitely also key in this whole process, correct?
I would say for a lot of different reasons, particularly people who have survived something difficult and maybe lost a loved one. In that process, there can be different things like guilt that come up. And I know from talking with you before that this is a piece that's probably essential for some of the people who are listening, and also for some of my clients who are pulse affected and pulse survivors. And if we look at that a little bit, I think that's interesting too. Would you like me to speak on that a little bit more?
Yes, please do, because I think there's the G word, there's the S word for guilt, and then there's the S word for shame that
Yeah.
people shy away from. And if that's something that needs to be brought out, and what it may look like for our survivors, then yes, please, I welcome it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I do think that that might be one of those big feelings that people start to feel again during this time. So yes, guilt and shame. Survivor's guilt is a common experience, particularly with those with PTSD or who are continuing to experience grief. And many of those clients that I worked with continue to question, like maybe why they lived and other people didn't, or why they made the choices they did in that moment. And often, if we look at those feelings of guilt and shame and the thoughts and feelings that are popping up and associated with them, we can recognize that um, there's really probably nothing that could have been done any differently at that time. So we start to see that it's a false belief, but it's very loud. And there are some people who think that humans have grown to have survivor's guilt through evolution as a way to continue to survive after something challenging, kind of keep your head low. But I do think that, so in some ways, maybe it's there for a safety mechanism or a purpose, but I don't think that it feels good, and it's not rational for many people to be experiencing that pain unnecessarily. So I think first maybe people can start with pausing mindfully to notice if they're having those feelings. And then if they're paying attention, are they logical or not? And even if so, is there anything that can be done? And also noticing, are they impacting my quality of life? How often this thought or feeling is coming up? And then maybe seek to understand like what's objective about it, but also take the time to process those emotions and really acknowledge that they're coming up for you, and make sure that you can engage in self-care that kind of reinforces your self-worth, that it is valuable and I am important and it's a good thing that I'm here. And then maybe connect with other people who feel the same towards you, who maybe the people who would tell you that you should not be feeling guilt and shame, the people who would show compassion to you, to connect with them. And for many people, those feelings can go away within the first several years. But if people continue to struggle with them, then I would definitely encourage reaching out to a therapist to see if they can do some more in-depth processing work to talk about it.
As you were talking about the sense of survivor's guilt, a thought just happened to pop up in my head, and it's surrounding the topic of being vulnerable or vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something where, we've heard survivor's guilt, but when we also look at other aspects to it, I know some of our survivors have a difficult time opening up again. And I know this is a very scary term for some, and this isn't meant to be something where we're trying to push someone for something that they're not ready. But we want to kind of start to maybe just look at it for what it is, for what vulnerability might look like. And I think when you mentioned survivor's guilt, vulnerability popped in my head when you said, people learn to keep their head low.
Mm-hmm.
And, is this one of those things where instead of punishing ourselves, do survivors not, have struggle with allowing themselves to feel that joy, to maybe feel that bit of peace, or, maybe I'm tired. Maybe I've been out marching or protesting all day to, can I give myself this little bit of sense of peace, and do I deserve it? Is that something that resonates, or is that something that, and how might it look like as we get closer and closer to June 12th?
I think all of what you just shared is important, and it kind of brings up two different things for me. One being vulnerability can certainly be hard when maybe trust or safety has been compromised in the past. So it's natural for people to feel like they want to close off, not be open to others. And so again, acknowledging that, and then really weighing the risk. Is this a safe person? From my history, this one event maybe, or these few events have taught me that things that remind me of it aren't safe anymore. So I don't want to be open to those things. And for some people, that's connection. Maybe those connections aren't feeling safe. But is it really because of this in the moment is unsafe, or is it something that's reminding me about my past and that my past felt unsafe? So really checking in with yourself again and kind of deciding in that moment with this person, with the evidence that you have now about this person, is it safe to be open and vulnerable? What are the signs? Well, maybe they've asked me how I'm doing and they really care, and they're pausing and they're holding space for that. And you can trust them not to share if you want it to be private, that you're opening up. So I think there is space for vulnerability, and ultimately that practice of opening up to people can create more resilience for folks in the future. And it's kind of essential to process some of the thoughts and feelings that are coming up for you. So if you have people who are inviting you to be open and you do trust them under the surface of maybe some of those apprehensions, it could be worthwhile. Also, the other piece about people right now, amid civil unrest and the Black Lives Matter movement, and George Floyd, and even with the coronavirus pandemic that's happening on top of that, and people are maybe dealing with difficulties in employment or loss, various forms of loss right now, on top of this anniversary coming up. So what I'm seeing for some of my clients so far would be that, you know, at someone's different intersectionality, they might carry different pieces of their identity that resonate more loudly with some of these efforts right now that are pulling them in many directions. So the memorial's coming up, and also there's a protest soon that you feel like you need to go to. And at the same time, you're struggling with your finances, whatever that looks like. So if you need to pause, to stop, to take a break, to sit down, to maybe say no to something, even if it does align with your values and what you care about, I think it's important that people have the permission that that's okay, that self-care is an act of self-preservation and so important. So if you want to continue to do the good work that you feel so called to do, you have to pause sometimes. And I think that guilt can come in for those folks, especially some of the clients that I'm talking with, like, oh, I didn't speak out 2 more times, or I didn't go out 1 more time, or maybe I didn't check in with my friends yet about how they're doing with the anniversary coming up because I've been so focused over here. Or maybe I have someone in my family with a compromised immune system, or I have one, and I'm kind of terrified to get out there amid the pandemic, even to go to connect with others and loved ones around the Pulse Remembrance. So people are all, as individuals, weighing so many different stress points around this and factors to make decisions. And I think it's such an individual experience, an individual need to feel safe right now for various reasons, that people hopefully feel like they have the permission to make their own choice about it, not to be swayed by the motivations of others around them, or if people say, no, come on, that everyone would hopefully have the ability to, first and foremost, make a choice about what they want to prioritize and not to feel badly about that. Maybe on one day you're doing something different than the next day, but setting aside time for each of the things that you care about and time to take care of yourself. It's definitely busy right now for folks.
I love that. I love that you mentioned for survivors or for anyone to always give themselves the permission, right? I think we forget a lot about giving ourselves the permission to say no, the permission to maybe say yes, the permission to say, hey, you know what? I was here all day. I'm tired. Like this is enough. Or the permission to say, you know what? I actually do want to go. And I guess it all depends. And I love that you mentioned that, because so often do we forget to tell ourselves, like, hey, give yourself the permission to allow yourself to also do the things that you need to do for you.
Yes.
And with you mentioning the COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter, I know it does seem like there might be some bearing. I mean, it is affecting this year's 4-year anniversary, and it's a little different of how it's going to be commemorated versus past years. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you a little bit about that and what your thoughts are. For some of the survivors who may be thinking, you mentioned if survivors may feel like, there's a sense of safety, right? And safety is huge, and safety is really important. And if making connections with others is a way to our safety, if being able to hold others or hug others or be in the presence of others, mm-hmm. How may that be affected by this 4-year mark anniversary, since, we're not here to talk about whether we think it's a good or a bad idea. We're here to just say, hey, this is how it's happening. How may you deal with it? How may survivors, so the question is, how may this 4 years annual Remembrance Day affect our survivors, since it's going to be online?
Okay. So I think that what comes to my mind is that humans embrace ritual and ceremony to support coping with change, loss. And so it can be essential for some people to feel like they know how they're going to spend that day or this time. And maybe they draw back on their minds to past years and what they did at the memorial. And they've been anchored into this vision for this year too, feeling safe that I know what I'm going to be doing this year. But of course, so much has changed right now. So the memorial being online and virtual does change things for people. I know that there might be some opportunities privately for folks to connect amongst themselves. And I do know that the virtual, from my understanding, the virtual memorial will offer some of the same ceremony components, but definitely different than standing next to someone shoulder to shoulder, feeling the warmth of the temperature outside, the smells, the sights, the sounds, hearing other people talking, the buzz with their emotion, maybe collective silence. That's impactful too for people to cope and to kind of process how they're feeling and to feel seen and heard. So I do think that those pieces of it help people to feel kind of grounded and together. And so if that's not available to them, instead it's a computer screen or a phone, and in your own space that you're familiar with already, where you live your day-to-day life, it might not be the same for folks, that's for sure. So when I think about that, it could be different. I just want to encourage people to think about then, if this is a virtual thing for you, if that's what you're going to be doing this year, to who can you connect to one-to-one? Do you need to make a safe and private connection with someone that is in person? Do you need to have a virtual call with someone that you can really talk to, that you trust? You need to have a phone call, at least one person that you can check in with verbally and connect with and talk to. Maybe more. Maybe people choose to gather together in small groups safely and share a meal and honoring someone. But with that idea comes, how do you also honor people differently? If you've been used to the same form of ceremony and all those same sensory components to grounding yourself and being in that space and togetherness, how can you feel that you've truly honored the 49 and your loved ones and your experience on this day, to make sure that you have kind of a new focal point in place? So, excuse me. What I'm thinking about is, before, I think you and I talked about this a little bit, people were drawing from external resources a lot. They have that memorial, they're there, there's so many external factors. And now people might be drawing more from within. So how can you lean on your internal resources a little bit? And by that, I mean, how can you pause long enough to reflect and check in with yourself and decide for you and the people that you want to honor, what is a meaningful way, even if it's you alone, to really spend some time commemorating them and checking into that connection that you have with them. And when I work with clients, I found that some people, when working on loss, can find a lot of helpful ways to do that. Some people might paint a portrait of their loved one or do something creative. Some people might sit and look through old photographs and really give themselves the time to feel the connection to those people and maybe the loss, and then some aftercare, shouting self-care. And then I think that there's other things like planting a tree, taking a walk, and really just maybe even conversing with the person that you feel like you've been disconnected from for some time. Listening to songs you used to love together, dancing, maybe writing a poem. If you have any spiritual or religious or cosmic kind of inclinations that help you to cope, is now the time to really lean into those. Either way, it's to embrace this time with intention, so that as this day passes, for those who need to do that, they'll feel like they did make a meaningful use of the time to honor them. And for some people, maybe with it changing this year and all the things going on, you might choose to take a day for yourself to rest. And that, in a sense, honors those people that you love who also cared about you. So it's unique to the person, but how can you draw within versus on external resources this time around if you're feeling disconnected from others during this time, given the virtual nature of it and all the things about safety that are going on?
Yeah, I know we mentioned I know you kind of touched briefly on the intersectionality with the COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter, and then to, kind of put the cherry on top, some people are just coming back from unemployment or from dealing with the financial issues. And so I think for this day, for many of the survivors, in order to be able to honor and commemorate the day, is preparation important to be able to allow yourself to have that space. And I think, you mentioned having the permission to be able to tell yourself when to say yes, when to say no, to kind of just say, hey, this is good for me, this might not be so good for me. So with that being said, and I know you mentioned it a little bit before, the intersectionality, can we just touch briefly on that? If you are, let's say, a survivor who may be dealing with, wanting to go protest, and they feel like, if they're struggling, and once again, do I go to it? Do I not go to it? Am I a bad citizen if I don't go to the protest and let go of this thing that happened to me 4 years ago? And not that those are my opinions, but just, worst case scenario, something like that and there's the shame and the guilt. Can you, for some of our listeners, if they're wondering that, can you walk us through that maybe a little bit, see what kind of conversation you would have with them?
Well, if I were talking to a client in front of me, I would encourage them to do a lot of the things we've already talked about, kind of looking inward, recognizing that it's okay for maybe one day to the next to be focused on something different. In the middle of a movement, if you're having an anniversary loss, that there is no shame in taking time to check in with yourself too. You have to sustain yourself if you want to be able to continue to push forward for things that you care about. And so taking the time to nurture yourself is essential. And maybe you, as an individual, would think, I think I'm okay about the 4-year anniversary right now. And maybe next week I can sit down in my thoughts for that. And right now, this is what's important to me. That's okay too. Or if you are terrified of the pandemic and you feel like you need to stay home and rest, that is okay too. So I feel like I can tell people that I think it's okay. And I can say to my clients, I give you permission, but who am I? So it's really about checking in with yourself, self-compassion that you're going through a lot right now. And that a lot of people are having the same challenge of kind of making choices. And that there might not be a wrong way to go about this. So what is most important to you as an individual? If you look back on these days, what did you need to sustain yourself? And what did you feel good about making sure that you took action to do? And did you give yourself permission to rest? So it's a balance, and prioritizing what feels most relevant to you when you check in your thoughts. What's the loudest? What's the place that needs the most healing if I have pain? And how can I do that for myself? I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yeah. I know you also touched about with this year's being a little different. Is there any way that these survivors can maybe start to shape their outlook of how this year's remembrance event, since it will be different, is there any way to build that into a positive outlook, would you say?
I think that's a great question. I think anytime that there's change, it's an opportunity for a few things. We can decide that we are okay with it and we're just fine with change and it's easy, or maybe we're not so much so we might need to adapt a little bit. How can we adapt? in the face of change in a way that gives us confidence that we have the skills we need to cope when things are a little different than what we expected. And that's an essential piece of mental health and also building resilience. So I think this year, if you are able to do whatever you need to do to make it through this time, even if that's drawing more internal than external in a way that you're used to, how can you see that as a strength of yours? That you were able to face the change and then actually do something effective about it that felt right for you in your gut afterwards, so that you can move forward with the next year and know that if you're faced with future changes, you'll be able to do that too.
I know change is a very scary thing for many of us. I know when it takes us, it takes us out of our comfort zone for sure. And sometimes I just can't imagine, if what we've been used to has come and has given us that safety. I really wanted to thank you for that, for for speaking on that and saying that there can be a positive outlook to this. There is an opportunity to learn how to adapt. And in that, there might be some strength and some resiliency that comes from that. Mm-hmm. And just to kind of change a little bit about the subject, what can we say to, let's say, family members or friends or community members who might know of someone and they want to be supportive or they want to be there? Because I think sometimes people think that what they're doing is being supportive, and they might not be necessarily listening to what their survivors are asking for or what our friends are asking for. And, what would you, what advice could you give us? What kind of guidance would you say for any community members or friends or parents or, family members who want to help or want to support?
So people from the community or loved ones who want to offer support during this time. I think after a significant loss, or really any loss, when time passes, people can stop asking. Maybe they just have an expectation that maybe for them it's getting easier than it is for other people, or they're uncertain if it's okay to ask or to acknowledge it, concerned about upsetting someone. I think it's important to acknowledge it. If it's someone that feels safe with you, to just acknowledge it and to check in and to truly listen is important. Ask those who've been impacted how they're doing without expectations for their response. So maybe they want to be open and vulnerable and talk, and maybe they don't. Maybe they are just glad to know that you're acknowledging that this is a piece of their experience, and that alone might help them feel supported and know that you're there if they do need you. And maybe they're doing okay and they mean it when they say it, and that's okay too. It doesn't have to be an expectation of any kind for them to respond in a certain way. So a listening ear. I do think that it might be an opportunity to hold space with someone and share the chance to talk about not only how they're feeling, but maybe even to honor those that they've lost. When people stop asking about that, what did you love about that person? What did you enjoy together? Those sorts of things. And that can be difficult to face if you have some loss. So again, it's your choice if you want to talk about it or not, but that space to honor those relationships, those connections, to really talk about it in the way that you would if someone didn't pass, can be just as important to people years later, because it's still a piece of their identity. Our identity is wrapped up in who we're connected to, our roles with other people, our best friend. I'm the best friend of this person. I'm the mother of this person. I'm the child of this person. I'm the lover of this person. So if you have the chance to check in and really offer a listening ear and maybe give people a chance to talk in a way that they don't usually have the opportunity, I think that can be a good thing to do. But as a community, like you're mentioning before, people are going back to work and people need to have their needs met right now. So as an employer, are you aware of some of your employees' experiences around this? Are you able to offer them time and still have their needs met in some way, adjusting their schedule with them, being flexible, accommodating? If you're a partner, can you check in and relieve some of their responsibilities right now if maybe that they're going through some things? Same thing in the same theme of kind of reaching out and offering support to people.
You mentioned, Rachel, you mentioned something about expectations, and I think that's, in my opinion, I think that's key, right? Yeah, someone who may be a friend of someone who is a survivor, well, let's say they think about it in their minds and they say something like, well, they haven't mentioned it, they seem okay. They haven't really acted out in a year or two, and they seem fine to me, and I think that can be kind of one of the expectations, like, oh, if I ask them, oh, they're okay. You know, for someone who might be thinking to themselves, well, man, like this happened 4 years ago. Shouldn't they have gotten past it? Or, and I think, a lot of people who are survivors of trauma or trauma survivors, they hear that a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
What would you, and I know you kind of mentioned that before, but what would you say to that again? What would you say to that kind of expectation?
So if I were maybe in a session or a group with people and hearing something like this come up, my role is naturally to feel like I should offer some education so that people can understand someone else's experience, or maybe their own. So what comes to my mind is just some of the implications for grief and loss and trauma and how they impact people. Because once we have that understanding, sometimes we can have compassion and maybe empathy and really understand a little bit more. So standard grief and loss are really unique to each person and have different timelines. But when loss is perceived as traumatic in some way, maybe there's a desire for justice, or it feels like it could have been prevented, or there's violence or maybe suffering that was perceived. It can create even more complex thoughts and emotion-based challenges to overcome for people. So those take time. And for those who survived that night, for many, it's possible that this experience has created signs of regular anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, possibly development of PTSD. And that's something they carry daily. So even if it's 4 years later and maybe it fluctuates, it certainly can come back around. So it can still be impacting people for that length of time. And symptoms of complicated grief and loss and trauma, for some can heal with time, but many might require therapy or other supports. So if we just expect people to be okay, then they're probably going to feel less likely to reach out and ask for that help and to find those supports. So it's important to have that understanding, to support them in getting what they need. And I think that each person will have their own timeline depending on kind of the depth of the psychological wound that they've experienced. And that's really unique to each person too, and all the factors that led up to the day that they experienced the trauma, or the loss. So there's no right timeline. And I do think that to get through traumatic loss, it requires acceptance, which can come through really facing and acknowledging the experience, which is hard to do. Sometimes that can take people some time if your reality has shifted based on a single day unexpectedly. And after acknowledging that, processing and actually experiencing those difficult emotions is really important. I've seen people seek services 3 years later after there's not funding for therapy anymore, right? So because they're just now reaching out, just now really hitting those hard emotions, and just now needing that support. So, and that's even still some of the people I'm working with who are survivors are actively experiencing challenges and being triggered by this reminder. So it makes sense. It's normal to me if people are still having trouble. It's important that the individual, their families and loved ones, and the community recognize that some of these people might still need help and still be going through this, so that we can reach out. And maybe, are there funding opportunities? Can you support somebody in that way? Do you have options for that as a business or an individual? Because people need therapy and they need help still. And so instead of saying, why aren't you over it yet? Maybe the question should be, how can I help you to move through this time?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I know some of our listeners, once they hear that they remind themselves, the key takeaways are practice self-compassion. Give yourself the permission, to rest, to feel like you need to do something for yourself, to go ahead and do it. Seek out that support system. Make some preparations if you can and if you're up to it. And if you don't have the energy, maybe reach out to someone, right? find that connection, make that virtual phone call or a phone call, or go out and have maybe a meal, or maybe take a walk. And I think those are all great ideas that, for our listeners to remember, just take that time for yourself to honor. And, as June 12th approaches, I really hope that it is a day for our listeners to be able to commemorate or to honor it as they, the 49 and their loved ones as much as they can, and in the ways that they want to, where they feel safe and they feel like there is some sort of, something there for them. I wanted to, before we just kind of wrap up a little bit, is there anything else that you would like to add for our listeners? Anything that maybe, just anything you would like to reiterate, or anything that, that maybe I didn't ask?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So I know that for some people who are listening, this conversation can be hard, and we're talking about many things that make other thoughts pop up in their mind or other emotions come up. So I do think it's important to kind of reiterate some key points so that they can take something away that's helpful. So my final words would be to be kind to yourself, ask for help, connect with others, honor those that you love and lost, and your continued connection with them and how that fits into your identity. Trust that you did everything that you could, and it is valuable that you're still here. And even when so many things we care about are drawing our attention, you're worth the permission to take the time to take care of yourself. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today about this. I think as an individual, it's important to me, but also the agency that I support, of course. And then I know the great work that you all do over there at OUAC is so important too. So I'm excited that I got to join you and also support this community.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Rachel. We love having you. And I hope this is one of the many that we can do for our community. I know we want to also mention some of the community events coming up for our listeners to know, and just kind of put it down in their calendars. Does your organization have, I know you might have some events coming up. Would you like to mention that for the listeners?
Yeah, so right now I think the key important things that when I reach out to our community relations person and ask, what events are out there, the main thing that she seems to promote is the Pulse Remembrance coming up virtually. Also, I know that there's an option by Equality Florida, I believe, happening next Tuesday. And then our agency is promoting an article through our newsletter that I think is valuable and kind of reiterates some of the things that we've talked about here today. Additionally, each week, right now, with so many different factors for people, there's lots of reasons to feel stress or have changes in your mood or anxiety and not really know how to cope or what to do. So every week, 26 Health offers virtual support groups of lots of different types. Each day they are posted on the Facebook page in the morning. So as we see what the community needs, we try to adapt to that. And for the month of June, they should be the consistent times every week, the same group at the same time, at the same link. So if you go to one and you check it out, maybe you don't even want your mic on or a computer on, you just want to find out what it's about and if it'll help you or learn something new, and you like it, you can go to that same link at the same time the next week. So I would say that those are the primary things that I would encourage people for right now, based on my knowledge. But I also know that there's so many other resources out there. So connecting with those that you know and seeing what they know too, and sharing, that's the beauty of the collective space that we have.
Yeah, thank you. We're also going to be posting some of the links in the descriptions on where the podcast will be posted. I know our agency, OUAC, is also having a kind of a Zoom meeting for some of our survivors to check in. It'll be a private, but it will be from 11 to 1 and from 6 to 8 on June 12th. But we will send more information out on that. Just wanted to, let some of the listeners know. And we'll definitely be posting some more community services. I know your agency is a great one for anyone who feels like they need to reach out or talk to. Heart of Florida 211 is also a great resource. If anyone is experiencing a crisis or they need someone to talk to, please call 211 as well. And Rachel, thank you so much once again for taking the time. It's great having you, and I hope that you know, as the date approaches, that thank you for all the work that you do.
Well, you too, Bessie. Thank you. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. I'm sure.
All right. Bye-bye.